Thank you. It's a great pleasure to welcome and introduce Scott Tong. I first got to know Scott in 2006 when we were both in Shanghai and he opened up the Marketplace Bureau there. But I imagine for many of you, you've heard Scott's voice often on Marketplace Radio, but this is probably the first time you've been able to put a face to that voice.
Well, we're in a soundproof room away from the world most of the time, so nice to be in front of people.
So in addition to spending a long time with Marketplace, he's reported from over a dozen countries. Before that, he worked for the PBS NewsHour. But we're here today for him to talk about his new book, A Village with My Name. It's a great read. I really encourage you to pick up a copy of the book after we finish with this. And we're going to jump right into some great questions so that Scott can tell us a little bit more about the book. And what I thought I did, I really enjoyed the character narrative-driven approach to the book. So I wanted to ask you to talk to us about a few of your relatives, some distant, some not so distant. Maybe we start on the distant side with your great-grandfather, Tong Zhenyong, who came from a small, out-of-the-way village that took you a long time to find, but ended up in Japan at a prestigious university in the early 1900s. Was that a surprise to you when you discovered this, or was that part of the family lore?
You know, we knew a little bit about my great-grandfather's story and thought perhaps he was the first person out of the village. So on the Tong side of my family, my dad's side, this is the first mover, the first person to go from somewhere to somewhere else. And so he's one of 5 people I profile in the book. The book tries to tell a long story of China, how China opened up to the world, told through 5 characters, 5 people across 5 generations in my family tree. So it works backward from the late 1800s. So my great-grandfather was born, we believe, around 1880. And so my father and I, in 2009, I was living with my family in Shanghai, and my folks came to visit us, and my parents are right here on the left there, and it's great to have them with us here. So my dad and I set out and said, well, let's try to find the Tong family village.
And it wasn't easy to find, was
it? No, it's not. And one of the first things you get as an ethnic Chinese person going back to China is different variations of sentences that start with "you should." And the first "you should" is you should find your village and you should go back. So to try to fulfill this, kind of check off this Confucian box, we had so the Tong village is in Jiangsu province. So eastern part of China, the northern part of Jiangsu province. So it's kind of the poorest part of a wealthy province in China. And when you tell people you're from this part, they call it Subei, and the closest city is Huai'an. 2 things happen. They first say, oh, the former premier, Zhou Enlai is from around there, and there's a little bit of excitement, and then the conversation stops. Because other than that, there's not much redeeming about this part of Jiangsu province. So my father and I set out, and we had this old pre-communist name of the village that a distant relative provided him. Took all day. We got in a van with a driver and tried to find it with, the government officials hadn't heard of this place. Once upon a time was called Fumaying, and the police station, and they couldn't find it, and we resorted to asking people on the street, which most people who are in China find themselves trying to find a place at a certain time, right? And then you just start asking people, we need some help. This is before smartphones and before GPS and all of these things. And we ended up finding a person who said, oh, I think I know this place, and but why don't you drive over there, and I know a guy who can get you a little bit closer. We ended up picking up 3 guys. I know a guy, and then the 3rd guy was the party secretary. And so when he got into the car, right, this is the Communist Party top official in the area, he gets into the car, and everybody knows it's the party secretary. So the car goes quiet.
They knew he was the party secretary because he was wearing the members-only jacket?
Yeah, he had this.
I love that little detail.
He had this kind of jacket, straight out in 1982. He kind of gets in, and it's kind of off-white as it needs to be, and he kind of got in. And somehow these other people in the car knew who he was. It was like a priest got into the vehicle, right? An important person got in. And he led us to where the place where the road ends, the asphalt ends, and then we kind of walk through a falling apart place, which ends up being the Tong village. And there's not much to it. It's next to a stream, and there's one of the rare places in China where there's nothing to buy or sell. You kind of walk down this brick path, and 100, maybe 200 people at most kind of live in these brick homes that are there. They're very basic, and the bathroom is the outhouse next to it, and the kitchen is separate from the main quarters. One of our relatives, who's the poorest one there, has kind of holes cut out for windows, but no glass in the windows. So a lot of villages are the undeveloped parts of China, as I'm sure a lot of you in the audience know that. What we learned about my great-grandfather from the people who we met was that he was a scholar, he was a good student, and he found his way to Japan around the turn of the century. And he got out, our village is next to the Grand Canal, which connects Beijing in northern China to Hangzhou and in eastern China. And he got out of this place next to the canal, and he went to Japan, where the leading scholars of the time, a lot of them went there. That Japan, as you all know, modernized earlier than China did, and he was part of this group that kind of imported these modern isms into China. Feminism and capitalism and Marxism and empiricism, all these things that were obvious to a lot of the developed world were new to the Chinese. And so while he was there, he married a Japanese woman. So he took a Japanese wife, which came at a great surprise to his Chinese wife back in the village. So that kind of stuff happens, right? When you learn about your family and you start to tell the story. What I take away from that is historians call this period, some historians call this the Chinese Enlightenment, when the Chinese came kind of late to modernity and late to industrialization. And I think that's important for me to, when I think about where China is now, this was one important step in this economic catching up process. The economists call this convergence, which is still happening. And this is one of the early moments, I think, when some of these important concepts were introduced, introduced onto Chinese soil. And what we learned is my great-grandfather was one of these cultural middlemen a long time ago.
And you also have an interesting story on your maternal grandmother's side, right? Mildred Zhao. And I just want to read a sentence that really grabbed me from the book about her. By the time she enrolled in boarding school at the age of 8 in 1911, my grandmother had joined a rare club of Chinese girls with the privilege to do two things that mothers never could: read and run.
My maternal grandmother was 8 years old when someone in her family decided that she should go to a boarding school run by American missionaries.
And that was really unusual at the time for a girl, wasn't it?
It was. She was, as best we know, an only child, and perhaps that was one of the reasons. I imagine if she had a brother, the brother would have been the one sent to school rather than her. And so she was born, as best we know, in Nanjing along the Yangtze River. And as I imagine the story, an adult, perhaps her parents, kind of took her up the Yangtze River toward the city of Zhejiang and took a left across this giant lake and ended up in kind of middle of nowhere Jiangxi province, the city of Nanchang in Jiangxi province, where she went to a boarding school run by American missionaries. It was called the Baldwin School, the Stephen A. Baldwin School for girls. And it is a great story where you have a collision of women's stories, right? For these Chinese girls, these were the early days of literacy and some of the kind of early breakthroughs in the women's story in China. The literacy rate, as you know, is really high now. Certainly a lot to do, but the state of women is, relative to a lot of the world, quite good now. And on the teacher side, these were my grandmother's two teachers, who she corresponded with in the course of her life, were young American women from the eastern United States who were unsatisfied with the options they had in the early 1900s. So one of them was from Rome, New York, and the Erie Canal, and the other teacher was from Baltimore, Maryland, close to where I live in Arlington, Virginia. So she chronicled a lot of her life, her adult life, by writing letters to these Americans, and we were able to track a lot of them down in archives in the U.S. And one of the big kind of lessons from that chapter for me is that the early part of the Chinese story is a bit of a global one, some international influences. When you kind of go back, and there are certainly roots that are much deeper than that, but to me, these important roots during the Chinese Enlightenment, some of them are more international and global than we think. So, to be sure, the Communist Party has made a lot of decisions, correct decisions, that have made the lives of the people a lot better if you kind of look back at a long sweep of time. But it's much more than a Communist Party story.
Yeah, the story about her learning how to read and how unusual that was for a girl reminded me of my first job in China when I was working in the Foreign Service. I was adjudicating visa applications for people to come join their families. And many of the applicants were older women, and they were illiterate simply because they were never given the opportunity to go to school back in that time. And they weren't even able to write their name, sign their name. And that disqualified them.
Really?
From immigrating. So we had to do the whole process, and I had to send them home, I was told, and they had to learn how to sign their name before they could go. And these were people who were in their 90s and had never learned to write, and it just seemed outrageous. So I kind of fudged the rules because I figured when they got to San Francisco or LA, no one was going to give them a reading test when they were 90 years old.
Yeah.
So
you let them scribble a little bit?
I let them scribble a little bit, and
looks
good
good
to me. Yeah.
Good for you.
Let's talk about another member of your family, one of your uncles, Tong Bao. That's an interesting story as well.
So my father in 1949, he was 10 years old, and he got out of China just soon after the communists came. They crossed the Yangtze River from the north, and they took over what became all of China. And he left with his father, and they got on there were two ships that were taking these refugees from the mainland who were connected to the losing side, the Kuomintang side, the U.S. supported losing side in the war. And the boat right before the one they got on was the one that sank. And so what I learned was the Titanic story in China, kind of casualties on the order of the Titanic. And so my father was one of the fortunate ones who got on the boat right after that took them to northern Taiwan. His brother got left behind. Very common story when I learn about families of this time and this generation. And so this is my uncle, and his story is this great. To me, it is a great story of how China, capital C, the place, hit kind of the lows, in the 20th century. But it's a great redemption story. So when he was young, China went through the Great Leap Forward and the famine, worst famine in recorded history. Some 40 million people died and starved. And I spent hours with my uncle in Shanghai kind of getting his story when he told me how they removed the tree bark and kind of marinated that to be able to eat that during the famine, and the lucky day when he found a frog on the way home to eat then. He says they had fewer rations than the others because so he and his mother and those left behind were politically stained. At the time, China had closed its doors, right? The drawbridge came up.
They were stained because they had family outside of China.
Because they were connected to people in Taiwan on the outside. And so my uncle would say over and over again that his problem was 海外关系, so overseas connections, overseas relations. So that he was a great student, but he was never allowed to go to the good schools while he was growing up. And during the Cultural Revolution, which began in the mid-1960s, he was one of the students who was sent away for the full 10 years, a full decade to the countryside, again because of his political status. He told me a number of times about what happened to his mother. She was a teacher then, and the students, the Red Guard during the most fanatical days of the Cultural Revolution, they would attack their teachers, and they forced her to, in the winter, to stand kind of her head bowed down underneath the tree so the icicles could drip inside of her collar. And she was forced to kind of stand down there for several hours. And then so life was hard in ways that I still struggle to understand back then. And then Mao dies, and in the late 70s, the redemption story for Chinese people and for him begins. So under Mao, the Chinese closed down the universities. And when they brought back the college entrance examination in 1977, my uncle, who was almost 30 by then, was waiting with a whole lot of other Chinese kids to take this test. Right? They were all trying to get access to university. So the percentage of kids who qualified for college was something like 4 or 5%. He likes to tell the story because he aced the test. He became an academic, an engineering professor, and made a lot of his money as a consultant to Chinese factories that were now contracting with foreign companies to export basic things to places like the U.S. So he worked for a contract factory for Black & Decker. That's part of the story he likes to tell at the dinner table, but he didn't want me to tell the story in the book. After 20, maybe 30 hours of telling me about the story, he said, well, you can't write these. You can only write the glorious parts. And so I called a timeout, and I said, the whole story is what's really important about this. It's kind of the redemption, and there are embarrassing and shameful parts of the story for him, and that's the part that he doesn't want to tell. And so I'm now kind of bargaining with my uncle in my second language, and I said, well, this book is going to, at the very start, it's going to be in English. It's going to be read by Americans far away. And my uncle says, well, I have friends in America. I said, really? You have friends in America? You have a lot of friends in the United States? And he says, 6.
So they're prohibited from buying the book?
Yeah, right. Amazon will find them. And in the end, I had the only kind of argument I've ever had with my uncle, and but he and I tell the reader this. So his surname, he changed his surname when he was young. So he was born a Tong, and then because of these bad political connections, he changed the surname to his mother's surname. That's the name he uses
to
now.
try and separate himself away from the relatives overseas.
That's right. And
but
so,
it didn't work.
It didn't work. I don't know if it kind of lessened any problems he had, but no, that it didn't work. And in the end, so that's how I came to tell his story. Now I don't know if he's read it yet, so the feedback is to be told.
Was he out of touch with your dad for many years, presumably?
He was. So Dad remembers when he was 10, and he remembers the toddler brother when you left. And it was not until the 90s when some correspondence went back and forth, and then you first saw him in the early 90s, right? In the late 90s, so 50 years. 50 years passed, yeah, but in between moments when they saw each other.
That must have been tough, and I don't know. Maybe we should take advantage of your dad being in the room when we go to the Q&A part and have a microphone.
Yeah.
All right. Before that, though, I also wanted to ask you about someone a little bit more younger in your family.
Yep.
One of your cousins, who decides to take you out to the suburbs of Shanghai and show you a complex built by the Kuomintang. Why did he want to do that?
That's right. So this uncle's son is my cousin. He's in his 30s now, and he works at a General Motors plant in Shanghai. And I got to spend a good amount of time with him. And one summer when I went back and was digging into family history, he said, I want to take you to this place in northern Shanghai. I had never been in that area before. And we walk up to this kind of imperial-looking building in the middle of nowhere, and it looks very, traditionally Chinese in front, and he starts explaining the bit of history that he's learned about this place, that this was in the 1920s part of a plan that fell apart for the Kuomintang to create a Shanghai for the Chinese people. That is to construct the government, and this would be the seat of the government, not in the old part of town, the old colonial part of town that was very humiliating for Shanghai and for the local people. This was, a Chinese start for the Chinese people. It turns out actually the building was very Chinese on the outside, but very kind of Western inside. They used most modern architectural technology on the inside, but it was a very kind of telling moment for me. And my cousin has always been kind of conflicted about. I mean, he has an expensive U.S. branded bicycle, high-end bike that he rides around, and he has his laptop is sleeker than mine, and he has a Canon camera that's better than mine, and he drives a Buick. So from the outside, he seems very Western, but he's also very conflicted about that. He said, well, why are we always trying to kind of copy the outside? Why doesn't China kind of write this chapter of history for itself? How come over time this is not, the Chinese have struggled to do that? And it reminded me of some of the writings of the early scholars when my great-grandfather went to Japan when China was so weak, the Qing dynasty was so weak, and they were debating how China could be modern and Chinese at the same time. This conflicted, we need to connect to the outside world and these ideas of modernity and industrialization, but it's very important to be Chinese. And so my cousin has the same challenge, and I think that's still a question for China today, as we try to understand what the Chinese government is doing. On one hand, it needs the outside world. It needs to invest and send its students around the world and its investments to kind of learn from what's happening on the outside. But there's also this cultural impetus to be, proudly Chinese at the same time. And I think as China wrestles with it now, the rest of us in the outside world are confronting it and trying to understand it too.
Was there any sense that you got from your cousin that he felt if it wasn't for a difference in boat tickets that maybe he would have grown up in the U.S. and had your job and he was wistful for that? Or did he feel comfortable and content where he was?
I asked him this many times. He never said that he has the kind of envy I expected him to have. I mean, on our side of the family, I feel, a little, I don't know, the word is guilt or something, that we've been so fortunate on our side of the family because of the one son who was chosen to come to Taiwan, which was connected to the United States and eventually ended up here. I think he is very proud of where he is now and where China is now and how he and his family kind of built it for themselves. Certainly people on our side of the family have offered to send them money, and they don't want it. So surprisingly, he has not kind of played out this movie of, boy, if I were the one who were in the States, who was in the States, life would be a lot better for me.
And that surprised you? Because I think that would surprise a lot of people here, that everybody in China doesn't want to come here. If it wasn't, obviously the wall is a big barrier to that.
Sure.
Aside from that.
I talked to him a lot about kind of about this family history, and so we talk about these decisions that affected these individual decisions that affected a lot of people as far as suffering and government and policy decisions, and he doesn't he doesn't have this boy, if things played out a little bit differently, my life would have turned out a little differently, because it's not all when he was born, China, still had, they still had ration coupons even when he was born, at the start of the one-child policy, kind of late 70s, early 80s. So, as much as he's part of this me generation now, it has not been that easy, and he, he's proud of what he's been able to make of his life, as a representative of his generation, and I think as a representative of today's China.
So you worked in China as a journalist for about 4 years or so for Marketplace, and then went back to research and write the book later.
Yeah.
Has doing that research on your own family history changed the way you think about China compared to when you were working there, living there as a journalist?
Yeah, I think differently in two ways. First, about the Chinese people. I think, working as a foreign journalist in China, it's generally an adversarial relationship, at least connecting with official China. Trying to get documents from archives and trying to get permission to interview officials, and we could never go to Tibet. I mean, there are all these kind of restrictions on foreign journalists, and there were minders who would, track not me, but follow my assistant around and invite her to tea and ask her what kind of stories we were doing. So you feel the restrictions as a foreign reporter in China. Going back as a grandson of China was a quite different experience. I did a lot of research on my maternal grandfather, who we've not talked about. He, at the end of his life, he was a political prisoner in the labor camp there, and by great fortune, we met a number of survivors from the 50s. I mean, most of the prisoners who went to the labor camps did not come back. They did not survive. We found a few of them who told the stories of what it was like back then, and a number of government officials who otherwise were not supposed to, provide help to people like me. They snuck me into the records department, and one of the women said, I'll be frank with you. You're not going to find any. You're not going to find any documents. We didn't keep them very well at the time. But what I suggest to the Chinese nationals is you go to the mass grave site and scoop up a little bit of the soil from there, and that's what a lot of Chinese families are doing now and bring it back home and symbolically, have something to bury to remember your relatives by. Just one example of a lot of people associated with that kind of darker, less told chapter of Chinese history, feeling that they have a responsibility to history and helping me to chase as much of the information as possible.
And yet, if you were a journalist for Marketplace back in the 2000s, writing about political prisoners and their treatment during the old days, the government probably would have stopped you from going out there. But going out there to research your own family, they didn't get in your way the same way.
They didn't know I was a journalist, but I think the restriction, if I were doing the story there, is okay. If I wanted to kind of interview people from that era or academics who understand this, and I've written about this part of history for China, they would very likely have said, "I'm not going to talk to a foreign reporter. I'm not going to take this interview." Because it's a more sensitive part of history. So how we ran into the restrictions more frequently was people who would frequently say either not agree to be interviewed, or if we did interview them, they would spend an hour not saying much. So they certainly understood what was sensitive about China today and Chinese history, and kind of the lack of access was sometimes just people not being very willing to share much information with us.
One of the questions that we've got from the audience is about your interactions with Chinese bureaucrats, and you talked about that as you try and research your family history. You talked about that a little bit, about going back to the site of the political prisoner camp, but there's also a great story in your book about going into the library or archives and trying to get documents out and running into the bureaucratic problems there. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and just overall, how did official China respond to you trying to do this kind of research?
not perfect, but certainly it was more positive than I anticipated. So my mother's family and is from Wuhan in central China, and so I went to one of the government archives there, and I went with a local student there who spoke the dialect and kind of helped me navigate through the system. And we first went into a university library where, if you're not a student, you can't get in. So history is literally a gated enterprise in certain cases. So I had been out of practice of using a fake ID for a couple decades, and he said, no, it's fine. So we got a student ID and went through.
You got a student ID too.
Neither of us was a student at the university, and so he called a couple of his friends who were there, and I was just, after we walked in, I was kind of waiting for people to kind of converge from three directions and tackle us, right? It didn't happen, except we were kind of going through some records and didn't find anything, and I think somebody was starting to kind of get onto us, and started coming down the stacks, and the student who was with me said, "We gotta go." And so we flew out of there. So that was kind of the failed first couple hours in the morning. And then we found one of the city archives, and they had a number of documents that my grandfather had, his name was attached to. So that was very exciting. This is the grandfather who later became a political prisoner. And it was, by then it was 11 in the morning. And we said, well, the bureaucrats said, well, there's all these documents. Which ones do you want? And I said, all of them. And he kind of steps back, because that was the wrong answer, right? I should have said like 3, because of the taxing work it was going to put him through or something. And then he said, well, what are you gonna use them for? Which is a common question. So we're kind of negotiating. In the end, I and the student kind of stand firm and say, we want all of these documents. And it's almost 11:30. Then he said, okay, but now we're going to lunch, and we'll be back at 2. Before we can photocopy the documents. And then when you're kind of dealing with the Chinese lunch hours, there's nothing really to do. You just kind of have to wait. In the end, though, the bureaucrat and the people who were there, they actually became kind of interested in the story. They kind of flipped through, and they wanted to know a little bit of the history and the story, and why are you back here? Very kind of privately inquisitive and wanting to know, and wanting to help in ways that they could. I mean, the lunch hour is still the lunch hour, but they more often than not were motivated to try to help.
And I think we have at least one person in the room who's an amateur genealogist as well, who's asking if, after going through this process, you have any advice to people who want to trace their own roots. And I don't think the question applies specifically to China, but just in general. Maybe including navigating some of the issues that came up within your family about exposing the good and the bad parts of the story.
Well, yeah, I think wherever you are, I think one issue is there are trade-offs to think about that I didn't think about on the front end. In the end, I chose a couple characters who ended up on the wrong side of history, whose names were never mentioned at the table, and I felt compelled to tell their stories. Because when you end up on the wrong side of history, nobody really writes yours. Nobody tells yours. So I intentionally chose to tell a couple of those stories. One of them was the uncle who got left behind, which means the person who left him behind doesn't come across so well in the book. And that those are trade-offs to think about. I don't have an easy answer for that. There are members of the family who probably aren't too happy about that section in the book. So what I decided was to commit to a certain narrative and certain voices that needed to be part of it. But there's a cost and there's a trade-off, and that's what I chose to do. That was number one. I think the second takeaway is so many people in China, when I went back, and I went back with my folks a number of times, and they kept saying, "You came too late for this project. You started this too late."
Because
Well, in specifically, I was trying to find out if anyone knew which labor camp my grandfather went to, when he died, how he died, any information on that, and a lot of kind of rumors. But the people who knew that information aren't around anymore. That was the late 1950s. So, yeah, I guess start asking now. And to me, that's what I would have done sooner.
did you get the whole family around the table when the book was finished and have the conversation? When the movie's made, who's going to play each one of us?
No, that question has been has been asked, but we'll see if a few copies sell first, and then we can cross that bridge.
Okay, we'll work on that tonight. And another question asks about the relationship today between your dad and his brother back in China. I wish your dad was mic'd up, so he's going to have to let you tell this part of the story.
My father's been the person who has done the most to reconnect with his brother. Actually, there are two brothers, with his brothers there. It was important for him to want to reconnect with them. So when Dad went back as a consultant in the early 90s, he visited them. So when I first went to China more than a decade after that, I had their information and connected with them. Their relationship is, when I see them at the table, kind of next to each other, what's interesting, the contrast is clear. My father's been in the States for more than 60 years, and he's very curious and inquisitive, and it shows in the questions he asks. And his brother is much more stoic. I mean, he has had a lot more colorful and tragic stories to tell, which he tells them a little bit, but there is, on the exterior, this, to me anyway, much more devoid of emotion, kind of emotionless. And I'm sure you got that in China as well. People have these very dramatic stories, and sometimes they tell it, and they don't appear very dramatic the way they're telling it. And maybe that is, certainly for my uncle, I think that's just the way he's been able to, perhaps to process it, the way for him to talk about it. But it's very distinct. Trying to get any emotion out of him and his wife was very challenging.
Do you think understanding that history helps you better understand current events in China?
It's very frustrating to me, how much of this history is still not told, and how today, a lot of human rights lawyers, they have disappeared. There are parts of the story that aren't told publicly. My uncle's wife, I think she articulated a certain period well. I would ask over and over again, why is a lot of this kind of not told to the rest of the world in a public conversation? As you said, at the dinner table, people will tell a lot of their stories. They'll be quite critical of the government. But for this history, she said, well, she was part of the Red Guard during the Cultural Revolution, and she said, we're ashamed of what we did. And it kind of, to me anyway, personalized a little bit of this past and why it was still so raw for people who are still around and still alive, in their reluctance to talk about some of these. A lot of the public conversation is still kind of behind the curtain, and I understand that a little bit more now. I don't agree with it, but I can understand it a little bit more.
About 10 years ago, I was having lunch with a Chinese friend, and his daughter, who must have been about 12 or 13 at the time, was with us, and we, for some reason, started talking about 1989. And my friend was telling me how he was a student in Beijing, and he was involved in a minor role in the protests, and we talked about this for a while, and then all of a sudden his daughter said, what are you talking about? She had no knowledge of these events. Now, that was 10 years ago. What's your feeling from going back and researching this history as to how knowledgeable the average person is about their country's recent history and their family history?
I had the same exact conversation with an intern in our office. So this was maybe 8 or 9 years ago, and she was helping us research some stories. Bright student from one of the best universities, Fudan University in Shanghai. So 20 years old or so, and then she came back to my assistant and me and asked the same question. What is this 1989? What happened? I have no idea what you're talking about. I think she'd read about it a little bit, and I was talking to my assistant, and this meant nothing to her. I mean, it had been so successfully airbrushed from history on the mainland that even some of the best students who were the best researchers, they couldn't find this information, which was. I guess I don't find the same amount of kind of interest in the history part of the story. I don't know if it's because people are savvy enough to understand parts of history are kind of off limits and people don't talk about it. The same way I think a lot of people on the street in mainland China today are not very interested in the government. From the outside, it sometimes seems from reading the news coverage that the government restrictions on the internet are the whole story. And my cousin, he doesn't care about that. That's not very relevant to him. I think in the same way, some of this family history, some of these histories were, a lot of my relatives were puzzled. Why is this important to you? Why every family? My uncle said every family has a version of this story. It's not very unusual. So why do you want to tell this? And I said it's because it's new to me, and it's important to tell. But I think a lot of people I ran into in China had that sensibility of bad old days, not worth talking about.
And talking about all these things and comparing your time working on the book versus your time reporting from China, and now, of course, on Marketplace, your beat's a little bit different. You're on the sustainability desk looking at environment, energy, natural resources issues. So maybe a little bit removed from China for a few years. How good a job do you think that the Western media does in informing us here in the United States about China? I mean, there's obviously a lot of reporting about what Xi Jinping does every day, but how good a job is our media doing really giving us the broader picture?
I think we were talking before we came about Ed Wong of the New York Times and his last piece that he wrote before he left China, and he wrote about, and all the facts are correct about how there are some more restrictions, more political restrictions, internet restrictions. The relative liberalism from a decade ago is different now, and that's right from it's an accurate description, I think, of capital C China, the central government and its relationship with the people. Most of the people I interacted with, what the central government did was hardly relevant to their life. They certainly weren't talking about internet restrictions very often. For them, their freedoms, for my cousin, the course of his life, the freedoms have expanded kind of remarkably. So I think that's a story that doesn't have as much of a news peg. So editors don't want that story as often, or they feel like the regular person, the middle class Chinese person, what is his or her life like? Those stories are harder to sell. Those stories are a little bit harder to tell. And so I think what the regular people on the Chinese mainland are really thinking about, what their problems are, what their challenges are. Sometimes that's harder to come across because, I mean, what Beijing is doing is very important, and their relationship with the outside world and the man-made islands that they're building and the investments Chinese state-owned companies are making in the rest of the world, those are important stories to tell. I think what gets missed, or sometimes missed, is what are the kind of the daily life, the real challenges that people face. My cousin is, the price of property relative to your income.
His biggest challenge right now, I think you wrote, is finding a wife.
Right. So he's challenged in the marriage market because he doesn't own property, so I mean, buying an apartment is, as far as kind of multiples of a salary, is so much more expensive than it is here, and
Well, be careful. You're in the Bay Area right now.
Right here, countrywide. Yeah, no, I guess I should separate that from the property conversation I have with my brother who lives here. But the story that breaks my heart is he works at a General Motors plant, and his girlfriend at the factory left him for one of his best friends at the factory who owns an apartment. And I said, that couldn't be the reason. And he looks at me and he nods, and he said, I think that's why.
It's a common enough story.
Yeah. Yeah, and those are the things, right, that you take a taxi and people are talking about property prices and how they can, that's the kind of economic and financial stability that people are after.
Another question from the audience is about how your kids are responding to this family history. I know before we came on, I asked you if your kids were here, and you said something along the lines of, no, they've heard this story so many times they don't want to hear it again. But have they enjoyed, are they learning about these kinds of details that most of us have never heard from our own families? Or is it too much information for them?
We have two in high school and one in middle school, and it's usually, dad's off talking about his book again. So, they have kind of the busy lives. They're not so interested. My oldest, Evan, who is a high school senior now, he does every once in a while kind of talk about remembering going back to this kind of odd, strange place where everyone had the same last name. And our last name in America is very unusual. In China, it's also very unusual. So I think it's in there to some degree, and when I'm kind of eavesdropping on them talking to their friends, they mention it a little bit, and going, especially the anecdote of going back to your village. Something about, even for a teenager, right? It's one thing to know where you're born. It's another thing to know a little bit about where you're from. And I think, hopefully they'll stay connected to that, and one of these days be interested in, flipping through the pages.
Another question from the audience is a little bit personal, but I guess since we're talking about your life history here, we can ask it, which is when you were working as a journalist in China, how did it feel to be ethnic Chinese but American and covering China from the Western perspective?
Very early on, it was clear to me that I was not accepted as kind of one of us, for sure. I made the mistake when I first went to China of describing myself as a 中国人, a Chinese person, and they said, no, you're an overseas Chinese person. So that separation was much more distinct than, say, in Taiwan. We lived in Taiwan when I was a teenager, so that was clear from the first day that I was much more foreign, than Chinese. On the other hand, if you're ethnic Chinese and you go back, these Confucian responsibilities, you still apparently have them. So your language is never good enough, and you don't know you don't know the cultural story kind of well enough. It certainly, in the end, I think it did help when we were kind of doing stories in the middle of nowhere that had nothing to do with government officials, just trying to understand people's lives and this fascinating urbanization story that's still happening in China. It opened up. It certainly opened up or kept some doors open, and people were kind of interested in my story. So don't want to kind of exaggerate it, because this is something else we talked about before this. I think because of China's tumultuous history and how the political winds have changed over time, even the person in the middle of the countryside, to me, is savvy enough to realize, enough is enough. This is still a foreign journalist, and people, in these places have gotten in trouble in the past for talking a little bit too much.
Well, following up your reference to political winds, one of the questions from the audience is asking for your views on U.S. political winds towards China today.
Business reporter, economics reporter.
Well, but economics is going to be the key to this,
yeah.
right? We're reading just today that the Trump administration may be gearing up for a pretty aggressive approach to China on the trade and economic side. Last year, for me, was shocking because when Trump was a candidate for the presidency, he was very aggressive and loud about how he was going to initiate a trade war with China, and then he didn't do anything. In fact, he's been boasting about how great a relationship he has with Xi Jinping, how he was treated in Beijing a couple of months ago better than any other person had ever been treated in the entire history of China. And yet he's surrounded himself with advisors who are pretty aggressively negative about China. Do you have any insights? You're in D.C.
Well, I mean, the
how
interesting
this is going to play out?
symmetry is how our president wants to make America great again, and Xi Jinping wants to make China great again. So they've got that between them. I think so many people are watching is the details of these trade sanctions that a lot of people, are a little surprised that they haven't come yet. There a number of these trade cases brought by U.S. Solar energy companies and aluminum companies. They've been brought under a section of the trade law where the president has enormous flexibility and authority to decide what to do, and if tariffs are imposed, how many what those should be. So those were brought by industries who were confident that the president was going to follow through on his rhetoric to impose these trade sanctions. To me, a lot of people in Washington are still expecting those to happen. Be careful. There's a trade war coming for all the rhetoric of this president having this this bro relationship with the Chinese president. But at the same time, you can't predict anything that's going to happen in the next 6 minutes with this administration.
Should I check my Twitter feed right now before we go on?
Right, yeah. So I think it's very. I think people are watching that very, very closely. That we have seen drawbridges going up in a lot of different ways around the world, and if the U.S. does begin a serious trade war with China, we certainly know what's happened historically is other countries respond. And what's interesting is certainly in Washington, people of my generation who saw the Berlin Wall come down, during college it's as if kind of free trade and globalization, because it's a good economic idea, the economists tell us it's a good idea, it's somehow entitled to happen because it's a good idea. I think now a lot of people who are watching globalization are telling us we shouldn't be so surprised that perhaps this openness we've seen in the last couple decades might not be the norm. It might be the exception over time. So I think a lot of these questions are being asked in Washington right now. A lot of people certainly expecting this trade war to come.
Now, you're the sustainability guru for Marketplace, so let's drill down a little bit on that. I went to a talk here in San Francisco about a month ago by Governor Brown, and everybody knows he's pretty focused and committed on climate change issues. And he mentioned China quite a bit and basically said that if President Trump was going to dismantle some of the programs designed to counter climate change, well, he would work with Xi Jinping because the California and China markets are so big that if they have the right demand in place and both economies are so innovative that he was basically saying we can just ignore Washington if Washington drops the ball on this issue and work with the Chinese? What do you think about that?
I think the state of California and the places in China where they have these policies in place, right? There are opportunities. There are opportunities to be had for clean energy and next generation power grid and all of these things. I mean, this challenge is an opportunity for a lot of industries here and industries in China. Climate change, has a planetary scale. More than 20 states in the Union have interesting policies to restrict their climate emissions, whether it's a certain percent of energy having to come from zero carbon energy sources. Different kinds of policies to try to push in these innovative technologies into the states. The federal policy still matters. I think a number of governors are trying to represent the United States, right, and try to accomplish the carbon emissions reductions that the U.S. committed to in Paris. Just the states on their own doesn't seem like they would get there. So I think the states could do a lot of innovative things, but when you have to add up the CO2 emissions, I think that's where the federal policy still matters. And what happens in the next 4 years, the clean power plan that was supposed to push coal power out quickly. The market is doing a lot of that anyway, but with these federal policies, it would have happened more quickly than it is now.
So you spent a lot of time in China over an extended period, both in urban and rural. Certainly my own view is Shanghai, where I lived for about 15 years, the air is getting dirtier and dirtier. Beijing is probably improving, but not Shanghai. And in rural China, many places are a disaster. How focused are Chinese people, at least the people that you interacted with, on the issues of the environment? Were people mad about it? Was it a constant source of comment? Were they pushing their government on it, or was it not a big issue for the average person?
So I went to a couple villages in Hunan province in south central China where more than 1,000 children tested positive for lead poisoning. So the local smelting plant, they violated code. Their chimney was not as high as it was supposed to be, so the pollution just kind of came down in the soil. And it was one of the rare chances where my assistant and I got to do the initial story and then to kind of go back and see if things had changed. And we went back to some of the same parents who, after it had kind of left initially when we first went, the local government was so embarrassed, and it was a national Chinese story, that they said they were going to take certain actions and reimburse some of the families with money and do some medical testing and try to bring them the medicines that they needed for these children. We went back about a year later, and the parents just had a certain resignation of, things. The government gave us a couple hundred RMB per family, certainly less than $100 US, and then they kind of left us alone. And there was a sense of, there was an anger and at the same time a resignation of, there's nothing really you can do. These are sometimes local small industries, paper mills, factories who are very connected to the government officials, and they have a sense that they're powerless. There's a new book out about, I think it's called Resigned Activism, about the environmental challenges in China. And I saw that a lot of anger, a lot of tragedy, and a lot of people who felt, in the end, there's really nothing I can do.
And do you think that their government is failing them, or are they doing a fair amount that's just not visible yet?
I hear so many people say the air in Beijing is getting better. I think the government is committed to this, and in aggregate, my sense is that it's going to get better. It's hard to have impact at the local level, and that's so often been the challenge. I used to interview you about these challenges of the local officials often get promoted, based on their economic growth and how many jobs they created, whether they were clean jobs or dirty jobs or, legal or illegal jobs. So it will take a long time in the Tong family village, there was an old kind of a tragedy poem that people would tell themselves that, you know, in the 50s you would grow the vegetables, and then the last line of the poem is in the 90s you get diagnosed with cancer. So it's kind of a dark joke there that's just kind of part of the part of life there. The closest relative we still have in the Tong family village, he died of esophagus cancer a few years back, and there again, his daughters are angry, but also a sense of resignation.
So one last question before we have to wrap up this part of the evening.
Yeah.
All these experiences, writing the book, to reporting there, to reporting on the environment here now, how do you feel about the next 25 years in China, and how would you compare that to how your relatives back in China, you think, feel about their future?
Oh, I think they and I are optimistic of where the general livelihood of the Chinese people is going to be. I had the opportunity in writing this book to take a longer view and talk to people who had a longer view. And the economic historians often talk about the antecedents of the Chinese story, some of which really predate the Communist Party, of human capital and education and market logic, and a central government, a central state that needed to make the right policy decisions and stay the course in those directions. I don't think that changes. And so I think taking a broader look at the Chinese economy, I'm optimistic that that generally life is going to continue to get better, and when you and I go back, I think the same when people don't talk about the government too much. I mean, I think the story of the government in the last generation gradually kind of getting out of the way and allowing people to move to the cities, the urbanization question, to be able to be more productive in their lives, that I think that story has a fair way still to play out.
So for people here in the U.S. who have a pretty pessimistic view about China, what's the main thing you think that they're missing that leaves you and Chinese you've been talking to more optimistic?
So a lot of economists have been talking about a chart by Branko Milanovic, State University of New York. It's called the Elephant Chart, and it tries to take an empirical look at who has done well across the world in the last 30 years. And it's shaped like an elephant, but the upshot of it is the big winners have been in the middle distribution in world income, kind of the 50th percentile. There's huge growth since 1988. And that has been middle-class India, middle-class China, among the biggest winners of the last generation. And the big word that economists use to describe it is convergence, right? That in the Industrial Revolution, there was a big divergence between 15% of the world and the rest. And now this long period of catching up and converging is happening. That's the story of my family. And I think that's the story of China that's continuing.
Yeah, the one statistic that illustrates that for me is that in dollar terms, retail spending in China now is about 90% of retail spending in the United States, and within a few years, it's going to be bigger than in the United States.
No, that's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the consumer market. There's a lot of talk of how China is trying to reorient its economy to kind of move away from investing and lending and pouring concrete to a consumer economy, and most people who watch it closely say that's been underway for a while now.
Thank you, Scott. I'm afraid we're going to have to say goodnight now to our radio audience. And to do that, I want to thank Scott and everybody who's in the studio audience here for great questions.